warm welcome to all panelists, attendees, and what's now become de rigueur, voyeurs. Now, it would not be hyperbolic to suggest that rarely has current unfolding reality lived up to the challenge of a panel title, which is A World in Chaos. I mean, just look around you. A long time ago, Tennessee Williams wrote, "We all live in a house on fire, no fire department to call, no way out, just the upstairs window to look out of, while the fire burns the house down with us trapped, locked inside." So yes, our house, our home, the planet is on fire, and we are its not unself-aware arsonists. And yet we are called upon by ourselves to put out the fires. It's a telling, even ironic, paradox. But such is the human predicament. The world has been on a knife edge of brooding suspense in multiple domains, at least since 9/11, and that's a long time to remain in suspense. One can become almost inured to it, at least as Western societies obviously have, if at the cost of the implosion of various societal pathology. In my own view, I don't see any great chances of amelioration. Au contraire, things seem to keep getting worse. And I say that not as a pessimist, because science is not and should not be whimsy-driven, but as a realist. And I don't subscribe to the chimera of hope, since hope begins usually where rational analysis ends. It is not that I'm discounting human ingenuity, which can certainly help rectify, redeem matters, perhaps even at this 11th hour. It is that I'm on balance according far greater respect to human depravity. What do I mean? As has been brilliantly noted by a Cambodian writer I recently came across, selfishness alone is sufficient to bring apocalypse down upon us. And the Euro-modern world has been founded on that very primacy of self-seeking behavior. In fact, economics, for instance, venerates it. And asocial individualism, which is the ontological fons et origo of selfish behavior, that other great gift of the European modernist ideology, lies at the very heart of all our manifold ills. And so the only chance we may have for even a limited redemption, it can only be a limited redemption, is if we immerse ourselves in a radical transvaluation of values. That is, to change our epistemologies. But that takes time, and we simply don't have much of that dwindling resource remaining. Now, here are the major, if obvious, unsurprising crises we face today. At the risk of being schematic, they fall into two broad categories: the existential, climate change, war, nuclear fallout, and what I will call the critically disruptive, economic downturns, societal breakdowns, and the gathering threat of the transhuman, that is, the malefic use of AI. I believe that this panel, with its abundance of talent, will help inform these issues with the scholarship they deserve. For it is scholarship that schools us, that is, in learning about the facts we face. The modus operandi of the session is simple. Each panelist gets 10 minutes to explain the current state of affairs and its causation, but from within their own disciplinary interest. They can read from script or speak extempore. That will mark the first round. In the second round, I will solicit panel opinions on whether they view the situation as indicating a collapse of our human civilization and or a deep restructuring of it towards a better or worse future. This second segment will not be timed, but do please help self-monitor and keep it under 5 minutes so each has a chance to speak. Given severe time constraints, especially with panelists scattered across remote time zones, regrettably, there will be no audience Q&A. Our panelists today are Professors Radhika Desai, Steve Keen, William Darity, Guy McPherson, Ivana Hughes, Genevieve Vaughan, and Fadhel Kaboub. Finally, to introduce our IT director, who will also be our firm yet kind time prefect, Ms. Diane Wiedenkoff. Do please say hello to her, because she'll be sitting there for 2.5 hours watching us. So with that as prolegomena, let's plunge right in. One small request, as each of you begins, would you please say something about yourself so people can place a name and a face together? That'll be helpful. So we start, I believe, with Guy. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Guy McPherson. I am Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona. I currently live in southern Vermont. And I'll dive right in, and I doubt it will take me 10 minutes to go over how absolutely screwed we are. According to adhering to 1.5C or 2C above the 1750 baseline are common talking points from corporate media outlets and paid climate scientists. The 2C figure came from Nobel Prize winning economist William Nordhaus. The point of staying beneath 2C above the 1750 baseline is to avoid triggering self-reinforcing feedback loops, any one of which makes climate change irreversible. According to the political body known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is already irreversible. The IPCC attributed the irreversibility of climate change to an overheated ocean in its IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. This report was published on September 24th, 2019, more than 6 years ago, yet I never hear about the irreversibility of climate change. The predecessor to the IPCC, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, concluded that 1C was the point at which self-reinforcing feedback loops would be triggered. Climate writer and speaker David Spratt indicated during a presentation in October 2014 and in many subsequent presentations and articles that self-reinforcing feedback loops were triggered at 0.5C above the 1750 baseline. I identified 68 self-reinforcing feedback loops rooted in the peer-reviewed literature in a long essay at guymcpherson.com. I stopped counting when I moved to Central America in July 2016 because I could no longer afford the cost of internet service. As you can imagine, several other self-reinforcing feedback loops have been identified during the last 9 years. As a result of the ongoing mass extinction event, Earth is rapidly losing habitat for vertebrates. This finding goes back to a paper published in the peer-reviewed journal Ecology Letters, authored by Quintero and Wiens, and published on June 26, 2013. The paper is titled, Rates of Projected Climate Change Dramatically Exceed Past Rates of Climatic Niche Evolution Among Vertebrate Species. The paper indicates that the projected rates of environmental change would require rates of niche evolution that are 10,000 times faster than rates typically observed among species. In other words, the stunningly slow rate of change reported before 2013 still outstrips the ability of vertebrates to adapt. Mammals can't keep up either, as reported in the prestigious peer-reviewed Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, with a paper by Matt Davis and 2 other scholars published on October 15th, 2018. Considering humans are vertebrate mammals, the loss of habitat for vertebrates and mammals represents a cause for serious concern. Well, actually, 2 causes. In short, Earth is amid the most rapid mass extinction event in planetary history. This event is irreversible, as reported even by the Designed to Fail IPCC. In other words, the ongoing mass extinction event is stunningly rapid and irreversible. I cannot imagine a situation that would allow for the continued survival of human animals beyond a few more years or a decade. I would love to believe we are an agile, well-protected species capable of changing rapidly. After all, as Charles Darwin pointed out in his November 1859 book, The Origin of Species, quote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change." Are we capable of adapting rapidly enough to survive? It would surprise me very much. Such rapid adaptation is rarely found in the ecological literature. I have never read about such an event applying to humans of the past. It's worse than all that, of course. Focusing on evolution by natural selection, as I have done so far, ignores other important factors. Consider, for example, that we are at or near global peak oil. Considering the importance of oil to our daily lives, and also the history of human response to national level peak oil events in the past, we face a daunting challenge when the availability of oil declines coincident with the continued growth of the human population. We would need some 20 years' notice to prepare for world peak oil. That was more than 20 years ago, and our response so far has been to extract increasingly expensive oil rather than reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. The last US president to seriously propose conservation was Jimmy Carter, who was a single-term president, at least in part because of his efforts at conservation. Each of these two important factors, abrupt irreversible climate change and global peak oil, poses a significant challenge to our ongoing survival. So far, our response has been disappointing. Will we rise to these most important of occasions just in time? I'd love to think so. The shifts in political power further to the right during the last few decades indicates otherwise. Adding fuel to the fire, enter Professor Leon Simons, a frequent co-author of the famous climate scientist James E. Hansen. Professor Simons cited NASA in the United States and governmental organizations in Western Europe in reaching his conclusion that we passed the 2C Rubicon. This conclusion presents a stunning challenge for those of us on Earth. It was released in October 2023, and it's based on an analysis that used the first decade of the 2000s as the baseline. Not 1750, as is customary, but 2000 to 2009. In other words, several of the world's governments joined Professor Glickson in October 2023. Not only was 2C above the 1750 baseline irrelevant, it's already behind us. As every ecologist knows, and apparently few other people, the rate of environmental change is the most important element leading to the continuation of ecological entities. These ecological entities include, for example, communities, populations, and species. Among the species threatened with disappearance as a result of the current and ongoing rate of environmental change is Homo sapiens. As with other mammals and vertebrates, our species will go extinct. Earth is currently amid a mass extinction event, at least the 9th in the last 2 billion years, and is driving many, many organisms to extinction. The only question that I think we have is when will it take Homo sapiens down with the rest of the species that have already gone extinct? I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. I think it's Radhika next now. Radhika, you're next.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me and making me part of this very wonderful panel. What I have to say may appear to be very different from what Guy has just said, but in fact, they are quite deeply connected. And I hope before I finish my remarks, I'll remember to tell you exactly how and why. My own diagnosis of the crisis that we are suffering is that the most contemporary efforts to try to describe the crisis, such as, we have a global crisis, we have a poly crisis, etc., do not convey what's really going on. Because the crisis is really not global in the sense that it's not coming from, it's not erupting globally, it is erupting from the economic system that dominates one part of the globe. And that part of the globe is the part of the globe, the Western world, basically, that is reigning, that is reigning instability, insecurity, military aggression, etc., on the rest of the world. So I think that this is what we have to understand. So the way I look at it, what causes the crisis? What is the crisis? What causes the crisis? The crisis is a crisis of capitalism. By contrast, by the way, I would say that countries like China, and to a lesser extent even Russia, are comparative oceans of stability, in the sense that in Western countries, what we have is a situation in which the underlying crisis of capitalism has then produced, has actually kind of worked its way all through every other level of society. So underlying crisis of capitalism, its productive debility, its financialization, etc., creates the inequality, which then, the economic inequality in which we live, where some people, can take trips into space just for the fun of it, while other people are sinking into poverty, including in first world countries, let alone in the third world countries. On this in economic inequality, basis of this, you create social division, you divide society between not just haves and have-nots, but real citizens versus immigrants, and white versus black, and every other dimension that you can think of. And on this social division, you get political polarization, and essentially a level of political malfunction. Connected with all this as well is a massive decline in the quality of political leadership as well, which is kind of partly relates to the question that a guy was asking. I mean, are we capable of adapting? We can't. How can we even adapt if we don't even have political systems that in some minimal fashion convey what people need, what people want to the decision-making levels? We're simply not capable of doing that at this point, and that's why the adaptation is so difficult. Indeed, it's become clear to me over the past several years since the pandemic, during which years we have basically demoted the question of climate change completely to the bottom of everybody's agenda. Everybody's talking now more and more about burning more fossil fuels and so on, and competing with one another in doing that, let alone discussing the other elements of the ecological crisis, ecological emergency, if we may, biodiversity loss, pollution, etc., etc. So, and I think that what's becoming more and more clear is that in the Western world, what you have is a situation in which no one will tackle the ecological emergency, any aspect of it, unless it can be a source of profit for large monopoly corporations. The crisis is the crisis of capitalism. Why do I say this? I think that the current the situation, the unrelenting onward march of especially the Western world, from one nadir to a yet lower nadir and so on, has really focused my mind, and I've basically rethought capitalism very fundamentally. I would remind everyone that Marx points out that when capitalism reaches the monopoly phase, it's basically past its sell-by date. It is no longer capable of doing the one thing that it did at one point, which is develop the forces of production. No matter how brutally it did it, no matter how anarchically it did it to some extent. And once it reaches the monopoly phase, it's basically ripe for socialist takeover. That's what Marx believed. If you think about it, capitalism was already had already reached the monopoly phase in the early 20th century. This also coincided with capitalism reaching, or rather the imperialism that is a necessary part of capitalism reaching its peak. As Lenin wrote in 2014, the world had been completely divided up between all the major powers, and now any efforts by the powers to get more territory under their control would only lead to wars of redivision. And indeed, we got such a war of redivision. It was not one war, or rather technically it was, to me it was one war, although we normally separate it into the First and Second World War, except with one important qualification. The qualification is that since the First World War was not caused by German aggression, but by the common inter-imperialist competition of all the powers, the defeat of Germany by the rest or by the other powers was not going to resolve anything, and it did not resolve anything. It only laid the basis for a new war. At the end of this long crisis period, which included the Great Depression, fascism, and what have you, and the end came, by the way, thanks to the critical interventions of the Soviet Union and China, particularly communist Chinese forces. Without that, the war could not have been won either in the European theater or in the Pacific theater. At the end of this period, a series of important thinkers actually thought that whether they said it or not, they ended up agreeing with Marx that capitalism was finished and the world would take a very different direction. But then you got the golden age, which prompted everyone to say, oh, well, these fears were exaggerated. Capitalism got its mojo back. We got, 3 decades of growth, blah, blah, etc. But actually, that was not what happened. The golden age is the golden age of world growth. And that golden age of world growth was made possible because Western capitalist countries were heavily reformed by measures that had to be taken in the political circumstances of the time, which would have previously been rejected as socialist, as Eric Hobsbawm pointed out. Number two, you had the vast, rapidly growing socialist world, the kind of growth that had transformed Russia from an extremely backward country by the 1930s into the second industrial power of the world, which was critical to the victory over fascism in the European theater. And then, of course, there was the developing world, which in these decades was undertaking forms of autonomous national development. All of these social forms were substantially to the left of capitalism. That's what gave us the golden age. And we know that today even more than we perhaps knew it in the past, because we have since then lived through 4.5 decades of neoliberalism, an attempt to roll back these reforms across the world, which has succeeded to a substantial extent. And we were sold neoliberalism on the grounds that this was going to restore capitalism's mojo. The crisis would be resolved. We would have productive dynamism once again, etc. It has done nothing of the sort. What we've got is a long period of low growth, low investment, financialization, skyrocketing inequality, and of course, very importantly, ecological disaster. Because if you look at any index of the ecological emergency, whether it is global warming or biodiversity loss or what have you, yes, it is going up in the period before about 1980. But after 1980, you see a step change, a much higher increase, so that what we are getting is the result. And this is combined, by the way, ironically, not with great growth, but with slow growth. So it's really less about growth and more about some other things that we could talk about. But anyway,
1 minute.
yeah, sure, thank you. So essentially, we are living in a crisis that is emanating from the West. In order to deal with the crisis, the West has become militarily aggressive. The West's imperial power, that is to say, its ability to compel other countries to do its bidding, has also become much lower. China's rise is the standing representation or standing manifestation of that. We have, of course, ecological disaster. We are closer to nuclear war than we ever were before. And all of this crisis is emanating from one corner of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I think, if I'm right, yes, my friend Steve is next. Are you muted, Steve?
Yes, I unmute. So let's see. Okay. I'm Professor Steve Keen. I've been a lifelong critic of mainstream economics, and I don't want to add anything to what Guy went through beforehand as the litany of indicators that we're heading towards an extinction. I agree that he's correct, because it's the climate scientists who understand this. My main perspective on this crisis is that it's the fact that we're unprepared for it is a product of conventional economic theory. Because if you go back to the 1970s, when the Limits to Growth report was first published, that was designed by engineers at MIT, not hippies in California, as people seem to believe. And by looking at taking a look at the 5 predominant system states of the global economy plus the ecosphere, their predictions were that we would run into a crisis sometime in the 21st century unless we radically changed direction in 1975. And the levels of change they spoke about back then were truly radical. One of them included stabilising human population at 1975 levels. Of course, that hasn't happened. Cutting back pollution by a factor of 4, starting in 1975. Equally, that hasn't happened. And reducing the amount of materials necessary for throughput by a factor of 4, which also, of course, hasn't happened. The reason we have done absolutely nothing to change that. If you take a look at the level of carbon dioxide and parts per million in the atmosphere, start in 1750 and then simply project forward an exponential rate of growth, we are still on that curve. We have never deviated from a rate of growth of carbon dioxide of the order. I mean, I can't get the percentages out right now, but it's been consistent exponential growth in that ratio for 250 years or 270 years now. And economists are largely responsible for us letting that happen because they have trivialized the dangers we face. What they've done, and this is a common fallacy in economic theory, it isn't only restricted to neoclassical economists, unfortunately, as well, and that's to believe that what happens across space will happen through time. So all the numbers that have been generated by economists and taken seriously by policymakers and journalists and the public in general too, what would happen if you moved a sufficient distance on the planet so that your temperature level rose by 2 degrees. And they then say exactly the same response will occur if you increase the global temperature by 2 degrees. This is brain dead stupid. It shows no understanding of what climate change actually means, but they are the people who stand between the scientists who've done the work that Guy detailed earlier to say what the crisis we are facing is, and the people making decisions about the system. Equally, we've had with neoliberalism and the globalization and the dramatic increase in inequality, the goods and services we produce these days would be potentially useless to address the changes we need to achieve once we realise that this truly is an emergency. And we have political systems which have basically installed serial narcissists as decision makers, whose only interest is in being proved that what they've always said in the past has been right when they're forced to change direction by 180 degrees by subsequent events. So not only are we facing a calamity, we have a political system and a production system which is completely ill-tuned to reacting to that when the crisis actually hits. I think all the time of what happened in World War II. I don't want to make a hero out of Winston Churchill, but at least we had somebody there warning about the threat of Nazism before it became prevalent. And we had a dramatic increase in the capacity to produce weapons of war in America, particularly the Liberty Ships campaign, very radically after when the war began. That preparatory power simply doesn't exist today. And that's what terrifies me once this crisis hits. And it will only be recognised as a crisis when large numbers of white people die in serious ecological catastrophes, which will be anticipated by the climate scientists to some degree, not by the rest of society. Then we'll realise the seriousness of the situation we're in, and then the political systems we have are likely to make it worse. So I expect World War type conflicts to break out once we, for example, suffer a global famine or the breakdown of the potential for agriculture in Europe courtesy of a decline in the AMOC. All these things are going to be existential challenges for humanity, which we are in no way prepared for, and in no way do we have the systems that are going to be feasible to respond to it. So I do see this as an end of species crisis, and the only potential salvation would be for the realisation of that to strike in the middle of a decline both in human population and human productive capability. It'd be praying for a miracle to hope that will occur. I still do. I still want to see the light of consciousness continue. But I'm convinced that, in particular, the discipline of economics has set us up for collapse by trivializing the dangers. And just to give you an idea of how much that trivialization is, a survey of climate economists, so-called, in 2020 found that the average prediction they made about the impact of 7 degrees of warming, 7 degrees, by 2220, 2 centuries hence, would it reduce GDP in 2220 by 25%, compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change. Now, when you convert that into a prediction about the change in the rate of economic growth from a direct trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming, it's a prediction the rate of economic growth will fall by 0.14% per annum. which is barely above the level with which we measure change in GDP today. At some point, probably certainly in the lifetimes of most people in this session, possibly, as Guy was saying, within years or a decade, the evidence will become real that that is a complete farce of a prediction, and then I think all hell will break loose. Guy was talking about 9 months of heat and 3 months of hell. I think we're in for another few years of heaven and then hell on earth. And my fear is that if there is any survival of human civilization, it is likely to revert to the pre-Enlightenment attitudes in reaction to what will be called an Armageddon.
Unmuted. Sorry. Thank you, Steve. I believe Genevieve is our next speaker.
Okay. I believe a shift in the self-concept of the human is a necessary way out of the end of the world scenario we are experiencing now. So I propose an alternative definition of our species. We think we are the being that knows, Homo sapiens, and that knows that it knows, Homo sapiens sapiens. Instead, we don't know that we are actually a maternal species, Homo donans and recipiens, the species that gives and receives unilaterally in numberless ways, and which has been captured and dominated by market exchange and patriarchal capitalism. The maternal gift economy of early childhood has been replaced on the large scale and in the individual lives of dominant populations with its opposite, the market economy of capitalist patriarchy. Going back before the market to the maternal economy, we can see how human relations are created from the beginning by direct giving and receiving without quid pro quo exchange. Discussing the indigenous gift economies of the Pacific Islands, Marcel Mauss in 1925 famously said that there were 3 steps in the gift relation: giving, receiving, and giving back. He did not see that the first 2 steps, giving and receiving, already create a human relation, and that this is typical in the mother-child interaction, even if the child does not, indeed cannot, give back an equivalent in return. The bonding and mutual recognition that ensues is also facilitated and enhanced, as we now know, by mirror neurons. The original human relation is unilateral giving and receiving, not quid pro quo exchange. The original gift is grounded in breastfeeding, where each experiences the sensations of the giving and receiving of the self and the other, but interpersonal mutual knowledge is experienced also in bottle feeding, in face-to-face interaction, holding and cuddling, etc. Giving to satisfy the need of the other gives value to the other in that it attributes an intrinsic value to him or her. This can be done with many different kinds of things at many levels: food, perception, as in pointing, services like carrying and bathing, giving the baby to someone else to hold or carry, taking her somewhere, etc. I have written about giving and receiving as the basic template of our human relations and meaningful actions, which instead are understood abstractly or as genetically determined, like language, for example, without referring to a possible origin in maternal practice. In fact, Noam Chomsky talked about the poverty of the stimulus regarding the non-existence of a life model for language. Instead, I propose the ubiquity of the stimulus, the universally necessary maternal giving and receiving practice as the model for language. Most extensively, I've talked about it in my book, The Gift in the Heart of Language, the Maternal Source of Meaning. We are Homo donans and recipients because we learned this interaction in our infancy, and the underlying structural template of meaning and value continues throughout our lives, though we forget and ignore it because our attention is focused on its contradiction, on quid pro quo equal exchange, which we begin to understand around age 3. Unilateral giving and receiving, which is necessarily the life model in the first 3 years and beyond, is ignored, sanctified, discounted, and exploited. In fact, capitalism can be seen as a system in which the many are forced to give unilaterally to the few through surplus labor, women's free labor in the home, and the plunder of the gifts of nature. The market, based on the logic of quid pro quo, invades and displaces the gift economy of childhood and creates egocentric adults adapted to making the market economy function for them. Capitalists find ways of nurturing the capital and making it grow like an abstract rematerialized child, adding to it the gifts of profit they make, and then investing it again and again in order to add more gifts, growing their capital. In fact, the hypothesis of the fundamental and continuing, though hidden and exploited, maternal human economy sheds a new light on who we are, what the economy is, and what we must do to continue to nurture life rather than nurturing gendered, racial, political, and economic domination, abstraction, and death. The coexistence of the two economies and the dominance of exchange over giving create a blind spot or blind layer, so that free gifts of care, free housework, free or low-cost appropriation of nature remain unseen or unrecognized as such. In fact, in capitalism, the maternal gift economy subsidizes the market sphere by giving unilateral gifts and resources to it, including providing the next generations of workers who give it their unilateral gifts of surplus labor. The focus of attention is now in 2025 on the oligarchy, on those capitalists who have been nurtured or nurtured themselves most efficiently, having succeeded in capturing the gifts of the many, and who therefore have the money power to buy votes and loyalties. This is particularly evident in the deadly coalition of oligarchs who have continued to fund and implement the mayhem of Zionism against Palestine, which has morphed into a campaign of starvation, destroying the means of giving for the population, so that the maternal gift economy in Gaza is deeply depleted and the web of life is in shreds. All this is accomplished with a display of terminal sadism by healthy Israeli soldiers who shoot the desperately hungry while the world watches. Babies with limbs like sticks and cavernous eyes stare at the skeletal mothers who, despite their breaking hearts, cannot practice the gift economy because they have nothing to give. Patriarchal capitalism everywhere, incarnated in its governments, militaries, business people, and allies, is taking everything, ignoring needs that are not made real or effective by money. So the gift economy is made helpless, and the web of life of the gift is torn, and the population falls through to its annihilation, in this case, leaving room for a high-dollar resort strip to be built in the Palestinians' martyred land. The disaster in Palestine is the preview of coming events, as the ego-oriented values of the market economy motivate patriarchy and capitalism to ever greater excesses of domination and subjugation in a world where scarcity is increasing and where polluted Mother Earth can no longer provide for all. It is up to our species, understood as maternal, homo, donans, and recipients, to recognize itself, up to us to know ourselves in a new way, to validate our other orientation and gifting goodwill, to shift the paradigm away from ego-oriented capitalism and patriarchy, and change our behavior by reframing the self-concept for both genders in terms of the maternal model that still exists. Indeed, it permeates our societies as the basic cognitive, linguistic, and relational structure, though it has been hidden and exploited. This is the structure of the mother world, of a maternal humanity, that while healing instead of destroying Mother Earth can and will provide abundantly and in peace for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. I believe Fadhel is next.
Thank you, Professor Kanth, for the kind invitation for hosting this important conversation. It's an honor to be with you today. I'll share a few thoughts on the current crisis that we're in, and I'll do that from a global South perspective, but primarily from an African perspective. And really, this moment that we're in is the natural progression of a crisis that's been in slow motion for decades, for centuries. And the work of Professor Rajani, Kanth, and others have essentially been warning us that this system is unsustainable. So what is this system that we're dealing with, so that we understand what needs to be untangled today, so that we understand the structural issues? And I'll focus on the economic issues, but it's beyond economics, of course. If we look at the current moment, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, the crisis of socioeconomic exclusion, you realize from an African perspective that this is not new, that the system that's been put in place during colonial times for colonial purposes was not designed for development. It was not designed for justice. It was not designed for democracy or human rights or any of the sustainable development goals that we're struggling to deliver today. And we keep talking about, why are we failing to deliver the SDGs? What's missing? It's because the economic role that was imposed on Africa and the rest of the global South during colonial times was never designed to achieve any of the sustainable development goals. It was a system of abuse. It was hierarchical. It was extractive. It was violent. It was racist. None of this is consistent with all the noble goals that we want to achieve today. So why are we complaining today that somehow today's world is unable to deliver all of those good things? It's because we're missing the analytical framework that identifies the specific economic structures that were introduced back then and were enforced in the post-independence era and continue to extract and abuse to this day. And unless we tackle those structural issues, we'll be having these conversations over and over again until the full collapse of the system that we're talking about today finally unfolds, as Steve Keen and others have already outlined. So 3 basic economic functions were imposed on the African continent and persist to this day. Number 1, Africa was supposed to be the source of cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. Number 2, Africa was supposed to be the consumer, not the producer, the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. And if you remember the colonial history, every attempt was made in the beginning to undo any effort that was already unfolding, by the way, in many parts of the global South and many parts of Africa and India and other places, efforts actually to industrialize, to introduce newer technologies into the production system were systematically destroyed with violence in order to lock the global South at the bottom of that hierarchy. And number 3, the third role that was imposed on the African continent and the rest of the global South that persists to this day, is for the global South to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and job creation and partnerships and all of that. And that is designed effectively to lock us at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And of course, we see it today with the greenwashing version of it, a greenwash, rinse, and repeat of the same thing, with all the green industrial zones supposedly that are popping up all over the global South to extract cheap energy, to extract water resources, to extract labor resources, to do the assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in Europe, no longer needed in the industrialized world, and to neglect the building blocks of development and prosperity that are needed in the global South. So these are the 3 basic functions that need to be undone in order for us to have a serious conversation about ending this crisis of capitalism, this crisis of development, this crisis of human rights, this crisis of the climate violence that is being imposed on the global south. So to dig deeper into the economics of today's, let's call them multilateral negotiations, whether it's the debt negotiation space or the climate negotiation space or other spaces, you have these sustainable development goals that we're clearly not on track to achieve those. And countries are saying, well, we can't achieve this without finance, right? Because we have this massive external debt that is consuming so much of our fiscal policy space. So let's dig into what is actually the source of that external debt. And if you look at it from an African perspective, it's three major structural deficiencies that also have colonial colonial roots. Number one, it's food deficits. Today, Africa, according to UNCTAD, imports 85% of its food, when less than a century ago, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. That was not by accident. It was by design. As soon as the continent gained independence, Europe introduced its heavy agricultural subsidies, the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day. It's a basic pillar of the European Union. And of course, those heavy agricultural subsidies to produce the core crops, wheat, corn, barley, soybean, and so on. Those were not just European policies, of course. The US, Canada, Australia, the former Soviet Union, and others did this heavy agricultural subsidies to displace farmers in the global south, to force them into producing only cash crop for exports, coffee, tea, tobacco, cacao, all the supplementary food items, to become food dependent. And guess what that system was called? It was called a system of food security, when it was designed specifically to produce hunger and food insecurity. Instead of restoring the food sovereignty system, the native seeds, the native crops that would solve the debt problem, but also would solve the ecological disaster that was introduced with the agricultural system that was introduced during post-colonial times. That's one deficiency, but the source of major external debt. Number two, it's the fuel deficiency, the energy deficiency. Even the largest oil exporters, and this is the old energy system we're trying to replace, a country like Nigeria, a country like Angola, the biggest exporters from Africa, to this day import the vast majority of their fuel from the global north. So you export the crude oil and you import the higher value added, the more refined petrochemicals, gasoline and kerosene and so on. So you're always locked out of the energy system with energy insecurity. And those are the big producers. And today, of course, as we transition to the clean energy system, we're also denied access to the manufacturing technology to use our own minerals to produce the solar panels, the wind turbines, the green infrastructure. And we're denied access to financing. According to IRENA, Africa attracts less than 1% of financing that goes towards renewables. And of course, most of that renewables investment is to be exported to Europe in the form of green hydrogen and green electricity embedded in assembly line manufacturing for other people to consume. And then finally, the third structural deficiency is the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have. And I use my words carefully here. Allowed to have, meaning you have to import the machines, import the fuel to power the factories, import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So you end up with an export base that produces low value-added content, and what you import is high value-added content. So you sign up for all of these free trade agreements to double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. So then take these structural deficiencies together, and there are other deficiencies, and you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade. What does it do? It makes your currency cheaper, weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. So everything you import the next morning, food, fuel, or medicine, is more expensive. So you're setting yourself up for social unrest, for a revolution. And that's why our government stepped in to protect the most vulnerable by subsidizing food, subsidizing fuel, subsidizing medicine as much as possible, and by borrowing dollars in order to stabilize the exchange rate. And that closes the loop. The lenders now control your economic priorities, control your priorities to invest in food sovereignty or food security, to invest in renewable energy for your own people or renewable energy for exports. And that is the system lock-in. That is the colonial control that continues to this day. And I'll leave it at this. And when we move to the rest of the conversation, we'll try to talk about what do we do today. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadhel. Now I'd like to invite Ivana, and I must say, all of us know each other, I think, but Ivana, this is your first time, and I welcome you to our group here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kanth. I'm really delighted to be with everybody. Despite the difficult conversations we're having, I'm grateful that you included me in this impressive panel. My name is Ivana Nikolic Hughes. I'm the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and the senior lecturer in chemistry at Columbia University. So indeed, we find ourselves in a world in chaos. And because I teach first-year college students and my own children are now 14, 20, and 24, so all either young adults or reaching that stage, I often actually think about the time that I was their age, which was in the 1990s. And in fact, I came to the United States as a foreign exchange student my senior year in high school in 1994. And at the time, my own country of Yugoslavia was falling apart. So I knew and really experienced sort of firsthand what chaos meant at the national level. But I think what's so different about what we're experiencing today is that chaos really seems to be the state of everything from the family to the local to the national to the international levels. And so on this, I really want to echo everything that's been said about the various aspects of this chaos, especially when it comes to the environment and the economy. In terms of the existential threat of nuclear weapons and the need for nuclear disarmament, which is the topic that I am here to discuss, things really could not be more different today than they were in the 1990s. Of course, that was the end of the Cold War, with which, in some sense, came a kind of complacency and really just the general public completely forgetting about the threat of nuclear weapons. In 1994, the year that I came to the United States, the doomsday clock by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists stood at 17 minutes to midnight. That was the furthest it had ever been, with midnight denoting nuclear annihilation. Today, the clock is at 89 seconds to midnight, so 17 minutes versus 89 seconds. And this is, of course, the closest the clock has ever been to this, again, midnight representing human destruction of life on the planet via nuclear war and other means. And again, we've heard about the threat of climate change quite eloquently from Guy and Steve and others. So let me just provide some context for why the nuclear threat matters in this very moment and what it represents. And I really want to just make three kind of very basic, essential points. My point number one is that currently there are 9 countries in the world that possess on the order of 12,500 nuclear warheads. Most of these warheads are far more powerful than the bombs that were used in attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The countries are, just so we're all on the same page, United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. And I would posit that all of these states are currently involved in either hot wars and conflicts like Ukraine and the Middle East, or in adversary tensions and potential conflicts. There isn't a single one that I would exclude from those two groups. And while there's, of course, danger that the nuclear weapon could be used deliberately in times of such widespread conflicts and tensions, I am personally more concerned about an accident or a miscalculation that leads to the use of a nuclear weapon, quite simply because a leader might believe that their country is under attack or about to be attacked. And this could happen in the fog of war. It could happen due to a technical glitch alone. And I think the conclusion that the risk of the use of a single nuclear weapon is both real and high. That conclusion is really quite a serious one. My point number two is that war games from Washington, D.C. primarily, but presumably other places as well, have shown repeatedly that the use of a single nuclear weapon, regardless of the underlying scenario, would lead to a full-blown nuclear war. And it's not that most simulations suggest a spiral into a nuclear war, it's that all of them do. And part of this is a result of longstanding policies. We can have a long conversation about why that might be. Part of it is these longstanding policies like launch and warning, but part of it is quite simply the timescales involved in such decisions. And these timescales are only getting shorter and shorter, literally by the day. Like recently, Russia has been displaying and sort of demonstrating the use of certain delivery vehicles that are just making these timescales shorter and shorter and shorter. And my third point is that nuclear weapons are different from other weapons because they quite literally threaten to kill hundreds of millions of people in a matter of minutes. This is not in days. This is not in weeks or months. And at the same time, nuclear war would also alter the environmental conditions on the planet by destroying, for example, the ozone layer, and even more critically, well, I don't know which is more critical. Both are really actually devastating. The alteration of the climate would occur in such dramatic ways. We call this nuclear winter. And nuclear winter and the resulting nuclear famine alone, and this is not, again, ozone or radiation or even deaths from explosions. This is nuclear famine alone is estimated to result in billions of deaths, depending on the exact scenario of the nuclear war that takes place. And really, I mean, quite simply, there's no other way to put it than to say this is the end of the world as we know it. And again, in a matter of minutes. And for this reason alone, nuclear weapons quite simply must be eliminated. And here I'll just quote John F. Kennedy, who at the United Nations in 1961 stated that that we must abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us. So let me just get to some concluding remarks here. There is, of course, much more to the nuclear threat than the mere possibility of annihilation. There are, of course, wasted resources in all of the nuclear armed states, but especially, I would say, in the United States, which spends more on nuclear weapons than all other nuclear armed states combined. There are, of course, people who have been harmed since the very beginning of the nuclear age, from the victims and survivors of the atomic bombings in Japan to communities around the world who were subjected to fallout, radiation, displacement, and more due to nuclear testing. But there's also this insidious way in which the notion that nuclear weapons keep us safe, and I posit that nothing could be further from the truth, that notion actually undermines deeply our ability to cooperate genuinely, to treat each other, and by this I mean states, as collaborators in addressing various threats to humanity and the planet and in creating a better world. What we are currently doing is actually basing the foundation of human security and international relations on threats of annihilation. And I think that until such thinking is actually eradicated, until resources are redirected for human needs inside nations that possess nuclear weapons and beyond, and until genuine cooperation is established at the international level, we will continue to not just be in a state of chaos, but to teeter on the brink of the ultimate destruction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana. And now I'd like to welcome Sandy, who I haven't seen for a long time. So welcome, Sandy. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Rajani. It's good to be a participant in this important conversation. I'd like to begin by saying that chaos serves the purposes of authoritarian or fascist leadership. Those leaders actually promote chaos to consolidate belief in the wider population that it's necessary for them to take full charge. I want to focus in particular on the role of right-wing identity politics in the rise of fascism, in the rise of our current phase of fascism, to be precise. Many years ago, Bertram Gross referred to a concept of friendly fascism, which was the destruction of full democracy by a quiet elite engaging in rule without rejection of guardrails or rejection of the rules of the game. But what we're experiencing is what's better described as hostile fascism of the type that existed in Germany and Italy in the 1930s and 1940s. So I want to explore a bit how these conditions came about. What are the circumstances that led to the presence of these authoritarian leaders across the globe? And to do that, I would like to actually share some text from a paper of mine that was published in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2022. And it's a paper on stratification economics, which provides the backdrop to the type of analysis that I'd like to provide today. Okay, so let me read directly from this paper. It is important to note that all identities do not have the same degree of salience in all times and places. Objectively, I might belong to the group of persons with brown eyes, but unless eye color is a distinction with material consequences, it is unimportant. In contrast, whether I am a Protestant or Catholic in Ireland, whether I am Burakumin or non-Burakumin in Japan, has great importance. Of course, the typical person necessarily holds multiple identities. Among that array of identities, some will matter more than others in determining their relative social ranking and conditions. Some individuals will possess a set of celebrated identities propelling them to the top. Others may possess a set of denigrated identities pushing them to the bottom. Still others may possess a mix of identities, some of which are celebrated and others denigrated. The full effect of the identity potpourri is an empirical question that should be resolved on a case-by-case or society-by-society basis, best determined by a quantitative social intersectional analysis. As such, stratification economics considers that context in a way that traditional neoclassical utility does not. Individuals themselves can dictate which identity or identities are more important to them. This may be situational, leading the most salient identity to change depending upon the circumstances. White women who voted in the 2016 U.S. presidential election apparently gave their racial identity pride of place over their gender identity. Isabel Wilkerson writes, "There was perhaps no clearer measure of white solidarity than the actions of white women in 2016. The majority of them, 53%, disregarded the common needs of women and went against a fellow white woman to vote with their power trait rather than to help an experienced woman in themselves make history." So in this instance, Wilkerson is suggesting that white tribalism prevailed over gender unity. I would also note that in the 2020 and 2024 elections, An even higher percentage of white women who participated in the electoral process voted for Donald Trump. Extension of the current phase of the American white nationalist movement to the January 6, 2021 coup attempt, replete with Confederate battle regalia at the U.S. Capitol, involved high levels of participation by white women. Globally, recent years have witnessed a surge in authoritarian leadership. Donald Trump in the United States, Narendra Modi in India, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom, Viktor Orban in Hungary. These regimes have moved aggressively to maintain conditions of rigid patriarchy and or to reverse rights achieved under the pressure generated by each nation's respective women's movement. The best explanation for their significant support from female citizens is that the authoritarians' women supporters have a stronger attachment to their racial and ethnic identity than their gender identity in these political contexts. In each of these cases, authoritarian movements designated a racial ethnic other as the threat to a perceived ideal order of things. In the United States, the targeted others have been Black Americans, Latino Americans, immigrants, and increasingly Asian Americans. In India, the Hindu nationalist regime's targeted other has been Muslims. In Brazil, the targeted other under Bolsonaro has been Afro-Brazilians, where extrajudicial police killings of Afro-Brazilians are commonplace and a reversal of affirmative action policies was underway. In the United Kingdom, prior to Brexit, the targeted other was immigrants from other countries comprising the European Union. The targeted other in Hungary has been Serbian migrants and refugees. So the argument that I want to make here is that the success of these authoritarian movements has been closely linked to the construction of otherness among a targeted population that's viewed as dangerous to the established order. That said, the last comment I'd like to make is I don't think we've paid sufficient attention to the question of the degree of coordination and communication between these authoritarian leaders. One of the most notable examples is the fact that after Bolsonaro has been ousted from leadership in Brazil, Donald Trump continues to support him and to advocate his restoration as the Brazilian leader. So I think we need to also pay attention to the degree to which there is actual coordination across these fascist regimes.
Thank you, Sandy. That concludes the first round of the session, and this is where I get to put in my 2 cents, and I'm only the interlocutor, so what I say probably doesn't amount to very much. So let me start. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So wrote Dickens about the period of the French Revolution 2 centuries ago. Those words still ring true today in our time. And why do I quote Dickens? Because, as used to be said about erstwhile East Europe, if you wish to know facts, read fiction. For so-called official Euro-modernist social science, I'll use EM as an abbreviation for that, is a travesty. It is a policy-driven enterprise where, far from being a science, is little more than a managerial tool of maintaining order. And its critics who challenge it are also no less policy-inspired, which is why we find ourselves ensconced usually in schools or paradigms which are oft quite incommensurable and spend much of their energy simply debunking each other rather than advancing useful knowledge. Truth is that EM society is, in its very nature and constitution, inherently unstable, endlessly lurching from one crisis to another, if one has a sense of its all too recent history. Far from reaching or maintaining any sort of equilibrium or equipoise, it tumbles on in a multiplicity of contradictions, and this is important, between individual and individual, between individual and society, and between societal and natural processes. So crisis is its quintessential kinetics, the very energy that gives it its propulsion. Have a glance at news headlines of the past century, maybe even further, to get an idea of the monotonic repetitiveness of this feature. We are kept preoccupied night and day, embroiled in an incessant process of conflict resolution, but not in achieving any lasting or substantive resolution, which is more or less the intent. This is true for all its touted myths, and boy, we have so many of them, don't we? Democracy, equality, free speech, liberty, all idols or idols. And it's somewhat oddly, we use ideals to examine reality and to hold reality accountable. But today, even within its characteristic turbulence, we're at a rather unique climacteric, where an ancien regime of 400-year vintage is running out of steam and finding itself upended by an emergent world. The clash of interests and wills is limpidly obvious to witness, and also, more importantly, critically dangerous to all. It is not that the situation cannot be reasonably managed in an accommodationist mode. It is that being reasonable has never carried a premium for the powers that be. As is obvious, EM societies institutionalize and legitimize adversarialism in all domains, legal, political, etc., so that an endless tug of war, and the term itself is revealing, is taken for granted as the natural modus of decision-making in all arenas. Who else but a modernist would suggest that hell is other people? That's Jean-Paul Sartre, by the way. So in effect, we're obliged, if not expected to shun one another. So war of one kind or another is how modernism exists and functions in its very lifeblood. Peace, social or political, is anathema and would deprive it of its essential logos. And much like justice, as close kin, we can only be assured of endless due and undue process. It is this constant, restless effulgence that gives EM society its historical, unique stamp. I've gone even further, but by reference to essentials of our human anthropology, to suggest that war is in our post-simple tribal state, is the near permanent condition of our kind, and that an iron law of oligarchy prevails in the domain of power. After years of reflection, long years, I've come to some definite conclusions about the wherefore of these matters, which had me depart from the core tenets of modernist ideas in which I too was bred decades ago, stated plainly, and I could not be more sure of this. It is the animal spirits of the human male that accounts for the destruction of the hospitalities of the original matrix from which we have evolved, which is simple tribal society, and the corresponding and subsequent descent into empires of so many kinds. Over time, these trends accumulate and telescope. The more complex become the societal modes of stratification, whence I call it all a rather sad chronicle of human devolution. A convivial species thereby gets transmuted into what we now experience daily, a surly company of irascible, isolate, and desolate strangers, from an organically bonded society into a permanently alienated one, divided both against itself and all others. Euro-modernist thinking, the sea within which we all swim and sink, is replete with delusions, only a few of them well-intentioned. That human nature, and please note the oxymoron, is malleable, like silly putty, and can be transformed by sheer declamation, propaganda, and or loud marches up and down High Street. I reject such notions and their various corollaries. Firstly, there is no convincing empirical evidence for it. Progress, judged from any vantage point, is neither linear nor cumulative, but rather itinerant and subject to wholesale reversal. But there's also some real anthropic causation at work that vouchsafes the truth of what I say. To explain, unlike EM theorizing, and I will not beg pardon for that, I argue that we are, like all planetary life, instinctual beings. Males and females are possessed, I maintain, of divergent instinctual endowments. Males with a demonstrable drive to aggressive behavior, and females with an equally apparent yen for nurturance. And that makes all the difference. No, biology is not destiny. It's not what I'm saying, but yet can only be ignored at peril, being the shadow eminence grise that guides human affairs. To put it in even stronger anthropic frame, since we are an indefeasible part of the hominid family, despite our high pretensions to the contrary, human males appear to take after chimps, females after bonobos, in key behavioral traits. It's curious, but easy enough to verify quite directly. All you need to do, for example, is to watch chimps go on the warpath to note the striking, if grisly, resemblance. No surprise, we share 99% of our genes with them. What is important is that these quirks carry enormous real-life significance, which we witness continually. To put it simply, all our fond utopias, and it's EM that invented that specious term, flounder on the reef of incorrigible male competition and violence. That's why the best laid plans go awry, and that's why plus ça change, plus c'est le même chose. In fact, regardless of the nominal political form at issue, be it monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, what have you, only a few run everything in all modernist societies. You can test this out for yourself. C. Wright Mills showed that convincingly in the late 60s with his classic work on the power elite. In other words, even elementary political sociology affirms, if rather broadly, what I say. In point of fact, everything I've said so far, everything I will say is verifiable, and rather simply at that. Not being a modernist, I do not harbor any wishful illusions about human society. I see reality for what it is, unmediated by epistemic distortions, liberal or illiberal. As I have noted several times in various works, to get chemistry and biology right, you must get the physics right. Similarly, to get economics and politics right, you have to have a sound anthropology. This latter attainment, modernist philosophers simply never had, so it concocted fanciful and wishful theories of human nature during the so-called Enlightenment. And philosophy, I'm sorry to say, is a very poor substitute for anthropology. The fact that humans are just another species of animals possessed of instincts clashed with the theological persuasions of Judeo-Christian thinking, where we are, leastways some of us, not all, configured in the image of divinity. And Darwin came far, far too late with his great correction, which is still in the 21st century under critical challenge, not least in the Western world. So to my mind, for reasons adduced, we are always and at all times hovering on the brink of disaster. The real surprise is how and why we still exist, not that we are in deep crisis, except that with the historically continuous augmentation of technologies of mass annihilation, again, the rationale I've provided explains why this must be so, which is willful, not adventitious, the scale and scope of disasters increases exponentially over time. As such, we may now be at an ominous tipping point where the next crisis, or even the current one, could well be existential and spell the end of much of planetary life. So evolution apparently has an inbuilt time bomb melded into core aspects of who we are as a species, which makes it all, to my mind at least, quite inexorable. Putting that aside, climate change and nuclear arms in tandem virtually ordain that we are headed for an imminent and certain extinction. The issue is not whether, but when. Not all of a sudden, necessarily, though one should not entirely discount that possibility, but perhaps in a series of cataclysmic events. Add on to that the violent stresses and strains of the clash of world orders, old and new, extant today, and you know the odds are bleak, and our fate is perhaps virtually sealed. And that brings me finally to the real crux of the crisis at hand, apart from all other factors named. It's as revelatory as it's utterly simplest and unsettling. European civ, and in particular its Anglo-Norman component, will simply not accept a placement second to another, which is where they find themselves today. Whence they will, in terminal bravado, force their will upon the other and thereby end it all for all of us. I am quite convinced of it. And I put this risk ahead of all other factors I've alluded to. So with these warm words of good cheer, since it's the season, I will close, but not without raising one highly pertinent issue. Most of us still subscribe to Eurocentric modes of discourse, consciously or not, whether they emanate within the societal sphere at least, from the traditions of Smith or Marx, or more conventionally from standard liberal, conservative, or radical schools of thought, all of European origin. This is the constricting EM spectrum of choice within which the modern world revolves. In my view, one needs to exit that vicious circle before we can locate and pursue meaningful salve to the problems we face. Problems created within a system may not be resolved using options drawn also from within the system, as Einstein pointed out a long time ago. Interestingly, Mao in China, Gandhi in India, to their credit, tried to embrace a few native modes of thinking outside of EM visions and got duly excoriated by their peers for that. More or less contemporaneously, the former succeeding somewhat more than the latter. Suffice it to say that the roster of human possibilities is not exhausted by the tropes of the European imagination, and we need to think outside of that ideational cage. We need to understand who we are as a species prior to any talk of amelioration, and we need to break with all those EM ideas that have enchained this world in the long, long phase of European hegemony, which may be coming to an end now, and think anew. I realize this is traumatic and not everybody's cup of tea. As the song says, breaking up is hard to do. But without that break, we will perish sooner than otherwise. Recall that the world would have modernized in a plethora of ways if Europe had not perforce imposed its own monist edition of modernism on all of us. We must also note that this modernism was never voted in nor welcomed by popular acclaim, even within Europe itself. Yet, that is what unites the entire world today in an unbreachable vice, be it China, Russia, India, and Europe inclusive. Time to doff those plans? I certainly think so. Anyway, I'll conclude with that. And now we move to a much more meaningful and serious analysis, which would be the second round of our session here. And I believe it's inaugurated by Fadhel. Go ahead, Fadhel.
Thank you, Rajani. And first, I must register an official complaint for setting me up to speak after everything you've said. It's unfair. But on a more serious note, the question of whether this is we're dealing with collapse or reconstruction. Collapse, I must say, a big yes. Reconstruction, I must say, a small yes, because we must be optimistic. But it's a conditional yes, because it really depends on us. Us meaning the non-Eurocentric intellectuals, the people of the global South, from the grassroots all the way to the political leadership. Because if we're truly talking about building, for example, a non-unipolar world, right, a multipolar world of some sort, no multipolar world today can be born without Africa and the rest of the global majority being repositioned at the center, not at the bottom, at the center of a new international economic order of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And I'll pick on an important line you said, Rajni, regarding Europe. Europe today, the home base of Eurocentrism, the original Eurocentrism, Europe today is living off of the delusional, the fumes of old colonial powers that no longer exist. Europe is a poor continent with no resources, with no energy, and demographically collapsing, right? Its only survival strategy is to double down on that Eurocentric vision of keeping its tentacles in Africa in particular, extracting and abusing, and hoping to keep its position more or less steady within the colonial hierarchy in which we operate. But the reality is, with the rise of China as a major economic and military superpower, whether Europe likes it or not, Europe will lose its presence on the African continent, will lose its access to resources, and economically will be swallowed alive by the rising Chinese economic superpower. Even the United States, as it's competing with China for global dominance, the United States will step all over Europe in order to keep its position within the hierarchy. So Europe will be the first victim, in a sense, of this collapse. Victim in the sense of dropping from the top of the hierarchy to possibly the bottom of the hierarchy. And that's why it's really up to the European elites today to wake up and recognize that they have an opportunity, maybe one last opportunity, to rethink their relationship with the global south, with Africa, to really embrace a framework of degrowth, a framework of reparations, a framework of atonement and reconciliation, because that's the only survival strategy I see for Europe. And this is with Africa, but also with its neighbors on the east, with Russia, with the Eastern Bloc, because this idea that Europe is part of a Western geopolitical hierarchy against the East is living in the delusional past of the Cold War that is no longer realistic from an economic and geopolitical and geostrategic perspective. So that's for Europe. Now, what about us, the rest of the global South? This is where a coherent long-term vision really needs to shape up from the bottom up with the right kind of political leadership. Meaning that if we are serious about this repositioning, take Africa today, a continent of about 1.5 billion people. By 2050, the continent will be 2.5 billion people. By the end of the century, 4 billion people. The largest continent on the largest consumer market collectively on the planet, with the youngest people. Today, the median age is 19. So looking forward to the next few decades, we have two choices. Either it's going to be a continent that's going to rise up economically and geopolitically position itself with real alternative development pathways that are not obsessed with consumerism and growth for its own sake, but redefining what is prosperity. And this is really where your input, Rajani, in the beginning of your intervention, of going back to our native roots of thinking what is quality of life, what is prosperity, and giving up the obsession with the Eurocentric growth and dominance model. And if we succeed in doing this, we'll be the first generation in human history to lift up billions of people out of poverty, out of oppression, without colonizing anybody, without throwing our own people under the bus, without revenge. We're inviting the world to a new page of peace and sustainable prosperity. And we have to do it on our own terms, on non-colonial terms, that will disrupt that colonial hierarchy today. And if we fail, collectively, then collapse is the only way I see on this map. But we must keep hope. And I think if we double down our efforts in this intellectual space, but also in the civil society, on the streets, and in the policy space, by sifting out all the political misleaders from the top, then maybe we'll have a chance. Maybe. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadhel. I believe it's Radhika next.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's been a fascinating discussion so far. So some very important and interesting agreements and disagreements. I think I'm probably going to say somewhat more or less what Fadhel has said, except I will use completely different languages to say it. So we'll see. Let's really, not completely, but very different language to say it. So, I think that both collapse and restructuring are occurring already. The question is what is collapsing and what is, and what are the agents of reconstruction. So as I've already said, it seems to me that the societies based on capitalism and imperialism are collapsing. They are collapsing because, and the two systems are interrelated. Capitalism is doing much less well because the imperial options are narrowing. And imperial options are also narrowing because capitalism is essentially in a kind of a weird involution that is going on. It's losing its productive capacity. So, for example, in the recent, in the ongoing conflict over Ukraine, the West cannot manufacture the arms that they keep saying that they're going to spend more and more money on. And indeed, there are many people in completely mainstream outlets like the Financial Times, which are predicting massive inflation because there's now so many people willing to buy these arms, and given the short supply, their prices will increase unnecessarily. So there is definitely collapse, but the reconstruction and the collapse will be, as I say, will continue, but it is also leading to a lot of violence, political fascism, as William Darity pointed out, and so on. So this collapse is ongoing. As I've already said, also the level of political leadership that is coming up in the West is now so abysmal that it is going to be very difficult to for this world to find its way out of it. I'd say one or two other things about the pattern of that collapse. I mean, it seems as though what's happening is that, just as in capitalist competition, the big companies essentially do down the smaller ones and so on in order to take command over the market. And we know that the market is shrinking anyway. So what we've seen over the last several decades is the United States essentially undermining the productive capacities of its own alleged allies, Japan, and now, of course, Western Europe. So that's really fascinating. And of course, the internet and, all the alternative media is filled with discussions of why Europe is allowing this to happen to itself. But we know, we are watching incredulously, but definitely watching Europe doing this. So yeah. Now, the reconstruction, it seems to me that the reconstruction can only take place on the basis of a non-capitalist type of organization, hopefully socialist type of organization, which is the only way we can take advantage of the advances that have been made so far, but harness them not to destruction, but to production, not to creating inequalities which are ultimately unsustainable, but to create an equal world, a solidaristic world, and so on. And we see that China, as Fadhel already mentioned, is, China doesn't have any kind of a pure command socialist economy, but it is demonstrating what is possible when a ruling group makes the welfare of the vast majority of the people its main goal, welfare of a tiny, ever narrowing minority, as is the case in the neoliberal financialized governments of Western countries. So it seems to me that socialism is the only way forward. However, exactly, and I also agree with Fadhel that, the reconstruction part really depends on, I mean, obviously, in some ways, China is showing the way. I think Russia, especially over the last several years, but certainly after 2014 and in a more accelerated way after 2022, has been forced to take a better path in order to have a more sustainable economy in wartime and so on. However, what the rest of the world will do is an open question. Clearly, there are some signs of hope. What has been happening in West Africa more recently, for example, is a sign of hope. But when I look at countries like, people talk about BRICS and how BRICS are going to go for, showing the way forward, creating multipolar world. But I think that the commitment that China and Russia have to a multipolar world, to a world based on the UN Charter, for example, on equal sovereignty, on non-aggression, and so on, is much greater than what you'll see in countries like India or Brazil and so on. Because I think that in all of these countries, the elites are still too wedded to the essentially the Western financialized Western capitalism that we see, in good part because the one aspect of it, which is the dollar system, is the ultimate tax haven, the place where all these elites park their money. And I think that as long as these elites are not overthrown in some fashion or another, whether it is electorally or in some other way, we are not going to get advance towards a more rational world, a better world, with any great sort of speed. So, and I think that in order for this to happen, and also the political forces, that need to emerge in order to deal with these elites. I mean, they don't quite exist. I mean, in India, for example, we've had for the last 11 years a government which is essentially, fascistic or fascist, if I may be more extreme.
You can wrap up, please.
Yes, and in Brazil, although we have, for example, Lula has come back to power, it doesn't look as though Lula has much room for maneuver given the power of Brazilian elites. So, this is the ultimate sticking point. I mean, will we have the sort of collective taking of power by people in popular revolutions around the world? I'm not even necessarily saying socialist at the moment, but that would be the way forward for restructuring. Thank you. Sorry about it.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Radhika. And now I think it's Sandy.
Yeah, I think that I'd like to hone in on the term reconstruction because it's reminiscent of the circumstances at the end of the Civil War in the United States, where the restoration and redevelopment of the country was ostensibly on the agenda. One of the dramatic failures of American Reconstruction was the fact that the ex-Confederates were permitted to re-enter into the political process as full equals shortly after the war ended. This was ostensibly in the interest of trying to restore national unity, but the price was the destruction of the capacity for the Black citizens who had been newly emancipated to have access to full citizenship rights. And in fact, we can think in the U.S. context of the history of the Confederacy as a prelude to the circumstances that we're observing today in terms of fascist control over the government. The problem with fascist control over a government is that the fascists typically get elected to power and then they never leave, or at least they don't leave voluntarily. So the question is, what is it possible to do to get the fascists out of power? And I don't have a really good answer to that. Frequently in the past, it's the fact that their megalomania has led them into extensive wars and they lose the war. Other circumstances are more random in terms of surprising and unexpected events. But the key thing is we must know that Donald Trump probably wants to maintain his presidency at the end of 2028. We know that he tried to maintain his presidency at the end of 2020 through an attempted coup. We know that something similar may occur. He's already talking about the possibility of actually running for a third election, which is not constitutionally allowable. But constitutional provisions don't seem to make much of a difference to him. And he may indeed attempt to simply cancel the election in 2028. Who knows? The key point is that we need to prevent that chain of events from occurring. We also have to prevent him and his surrogates from coming back to power at some future point. So we have to be prepared on both of those dimensions, but I really don't have a good answer about how to do it.
Thank you, Sandy. And so, Ivana, this is an important question, I suppose. is the nuclear threat so dire that there's no talk of reconstruction that is relevant anymore? We're headed for disaster, or I think you should really help us.
Yeah. No, thank you for giving me the floor. I am joining this meeting from New York City, so I do want to just make a side point of the election of Zoran Mamdani, which I think is the most exciting thing to happen in American political electoral politics in a very long time, I would say. And in fact, Zoran grew up in my neighborhood. His father is a professor at Columbia, so this personally means a great deal to me and to many people in New York City who voted for him overwhelmingly. So that aside, when you shared this question, I interpreted it in absolutely completely narrow terms, where collapse is actually that midnight from the doomsday clock, right? And restructuring is we actually do something about the nuclear threat. So I'm going to speak in those terms, but I, of course, recognize that the discussion is much richer and broader than the boundaries that I'm setting here. And in terms of the actual collapse, I've spoken about this, and I always say it could happen anytime. And I'll just refer everyone who hasn't yet, you absolutely must read the book Nuclear War, a Scenario, written by Annie Jacobson. She's become a really great friend of mine over the last year. She's a fantastic woman. The book is amazing. And I've also described how I sort of came to read the book because everybody else in the field was reading the book. And I sort of thought to myself, okay, Miss Annie Jacobson, journalist, what are you going to teach me? And I couldn't put the book down once I started reading it. For 2 days, I just read the book. So anyway, book aside, that's collapse. Read it and you'll understand what collapse could mean, and that it could happen tomorrow, that it could happen in a month, in a year, in however many years. So that's real. The restructuring and I guess the sense of hope or optimism that I do want to inject in on this conversation. One is looking at past times when we actually had some successes related to nuclear disarmament or just nuclear weapons in general. One success story is from the 60s, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was negotiated by John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev, and really ended something that had been a mortal threat to people all around the planet for, at least basically a couple of decades. Another is, of course, the 1980s, when we saw a reversal in the nuclear arms race. So I said that there are currently 12,500 nuclear warheads in the world. In 1986, there were 70,000, right? And so there's actually some reason for optimism there, that we were able to reduce those numbers in very significant terms. In fact, in 1986 in Reykjavik, Gorbachev and Reagan almost agreed to eliminate the nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union. The sticky point was the Star Wars program, which Reagan and basically his advisors wanted to keep going. Today we have President Trump talking about a golden dome. It shows a total and absolute lack of any kind of understanding that that project is absolutely doomed to fail, no matter how much money you throw at it. It is complete nonsense. It was nonsense in the 80s. Star Wars was nonsense in the 80s. Golden Dome is nonsense today. And if anyone's interested, I can refer you to resources and so on. But the more, even what gives me even more hope is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is a UN treaty. The UN, I really love the quote by the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who stated that the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell. That is what the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is attempting to do. And the exciting thing there is that it's really a treaty led by the Global South. And we have recently passed more than half of UN member states have now either ratified the treaty or have signed it. And of course, all of you are going to ask me, have any of the nuclear armed states signed or ratified the treaty? Of course not. But the pressure must be put on these states, both from the outside, and that's by more and more countries joining the treaty, but also from inside the countries by people waking up to the threat and doing something about it. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana. I think we'd like to hear from Guy on what to expect. Guy, you're next.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're headed for increasingly deeper collapse with every month or year. And the reason I believe that is that we have, if for example, we reduce our use of fossil fuels, and that seems like a dream to me, but even if we manage to do that, we know that that will invoke the aerosol masking effect. We've seen this at regional levels, most recently over the Atlantic Ocean, when so-called bunker fuels were eliminated and we switched to cleaner fuels. And what did that do? It made it extremely hot very quickly over the Atlantic Ocean because we weren't producing those aerosols anymore that blocked incoming sunlight. So I just don't see a way beyond an ever deepening collapse. And the only question is whether it happens next month or next year or in 5 years. And so I'm grateful for the time we have. And I try to focus my life on individual cooperation, individual friendships, rather than thinking about what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years. And maybe that's short-sighted of me, but the evidence indicates that that's the direction we should be thinking. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation.
Well, thank you for being here. I believe that's Genevieve next on the same issue. Are we collapsing? Are we restructuring? A bit of both?
Yes, we are. I think we are collapsing, and I do think that we have to do whatever we can anyway during this collapse, because there may be some positive outcome that we don't see that we can collaborate towards creating. I disagree with Rajani about the us being bonobos and chimps, because I think that we are all animals, yes, but in our first years of life, we get this paradigm of a gift economy that develops our capacities of thinking and feeling and other orientation. And we have had slapped upon that, we've had this whole capitalist structure that is taking from it. It's a parasite on the maternal way and on the way of so-called primitive people who are primitive because they're before, like babies are before adults. And this is a whole strata of a different way of reason that is not the one that is motivates the capitalist and patriarchal way. And to refine that within ourselves and each other and promote it may be a way out. So I'm thinking that this paradigm shift in which we have a different self-concept that then we can use as a background for making choices can be a way out, a salvation from what the rest of this reasoning and the other paradigm, this paradigm of patriarchal capitalism, of Homo sapiens, has created. So that's my 2 cents.
I was muted. I'm sorry. I think it's Steve now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right.
Yeah.
I'll put myself back on video. Okay. I'm going to take us back almost a century to CP Snow because I think one thing which has become obvious to me on this panel, particularly with Guy's comments and my comments versus the remainder of the commentators, people working in humanities tend not to read the physical sciences. They tend not to know about them. So the range of crises and the range of responses that have been put forward here are quite dramatic because we're focusing upon political fixes, the racial elements of human conflict, whether Africa is going to grow or not over the next century. Climate scientists, a guy is really channeling what I'm getting from having the extensive reading that I do of climate scientists. I wouldn't be able to put a percentage on it. Guy might have a better feeling, but I think probably about half the people who work in climate science expect humanity to go extinct this century. Okay? This is not a case of minor adjustments to our political system or let the market rule or better implementations. Really, probably the majority of climate scientists becoming so pessimistic they don't expect our species to continue. Now, if they're right, and I'm afraid I think I lean in their favour, I think they are, then the type of social responses we have to make to have any chance of surviving fall well outside any of the political parameters that normally apply in the social sciences. It even probably means authoritarian situations because at some point we'll be forced to decide what do we do if we want to reduce global temperatures by, say, 4 degrees, which may be necessary to reverse the momentum of the 2-degree increase we've virtually caused already. And the question is, okay, which sections of humans are going to die? Probably because of these interventions to enable some potential to restabilise the biosphere, which we've completely destabilised. So I don't think social sciences have got anything prepared for anything like the scale of what we need to consider, given the disturbance we've made to the biosphere. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why the social sciences aren't aware of that. One is, as C.P. Snow said back in the 1930s, that people who work in humanities have the same level of ignorance of physical sciences that a scientist might have who hasn't ever read Shakespeare if you don't understand the laws of thermodynamics, or at least aware that they exist. A huge part of our conversations in the social sciences are completely devoid of the energy implications of human civilization, not so much in terms of the heat we actually generate right now, but the heat we trap with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. But even if that didn't apply, one of the most chilling estimates of the future is given by the physicist Tom Murphy, and I highly recommend looking at his work, particularly a blog post called Finite Physicist Meets Exponential Economist, but also the free book he's put out detailing in at complete detail the thermodynamic challenges we have of surviving on this biosphere. He pointed out that if we continue the rate of growth of energy consumption that has already applied for the last 250 years, which is about a 2.7%, 2.8% growth in energy consumption per year ever since the Industrial Revolution began, 2.3% rate per year involves a tenfold increase in energy consumption per century, and 4 more centuries of that rate of growth will mean that even waste heat generated as a necessary outcome of using energy to do work, that will raise the temperature of the planet to 100 degrees Celsius. Now, that's without global warming. That's without any negative consequences on the biosphere, apart from the sheer dumping of waste heat from using energy on a limited biosphere. We really need to get our heads around those constraints to have any idea of what we face, not just now, but even if we survive it, what we have to do to maintain civilization and life on the planet in the next, hopefully, many centuries. But we have really pushed ourselves so close to the collapse of the biosphere by ignoring the thermodynamic implications of what we're doing as a civilization and as a species which can use more energy than it can simply harvest by eating grass or eating other animals. We are potentially making the earth uninhabitable. And unless we realize that, all our political discussions are useless. They'll be a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Thank you, Steve. So that concludes the second round of our session here. Since Radhika has to leave in just a few minutes, perhaps I'll have her offer some comments on everything that we have discussed in the second round here. Radhika, would you like to make some
Sure.
concluding? Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe the only thing I'd say is that where I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap in what we have all said, but where perhaps find myself differing from some of the others is my emphasis on, obviously, on capitalism as a way of organizing our societies, which systematically introduces, I mean, it creates a situation in which the economy governs us rather than us governing the economy. It determines us rather than us determining ourselves. And I think that this is what makes us lose control. You know, Marx says somewhere that you cannot, you know, in the opening chapters on rent in volume 3, he says you can't have a rational agronomy unless you have socialism, because that's the only kind of society which will now be in control of itself. Because under a regime of private property, there is absolutely no way in which we can resolve the profound problems that Guy and Steve in particular have, you know, the ecological problems that they have underlined. Because you see, I mean, I don't at all deny what Steve is just saying. You know, I mean, to me, if I start reading a paper on global warming, after a while, you know, the scientific aspects of it, my eyes glaze over. I don't really understand what's going on, but I know that people like you do. I take it very seriously, and I understand it. What I'm saying is that our capacity to deal with it as a society is absent, because we organize ourselves in a certain way. That's what I'm trying to say. So that no matter how much amazing people like you understand the problems of our society, we will not be capable of dealing with them. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And I guess the second thing I'd like to say is that I think the extent to which the United States is responsible for leading us astray. I mean, you know, Ivana, I actually forwarded you a paper. I hope you don't mind. But in it, you know, I wrote a paper ages ago on capitalism. I called it The Long Shadow of Hiroshima, Capitalism and Nuclear Weapons. And in it, I pointed out that we have to understand that the United States is the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons. For all the talk of rogue states and so on, it did so without having any serious legitimation for it. It did so not in order to prevent 500,000 lives being lost in an invasion of Japan. Japan was already suing for peace. It did it in order to show the Soviet Union, which was its biggest enemy to its imperialism thus far, that it had these weapons. And in that paper, I also showed that in the, you know, I'm not, apart from the imperialist powers like the United States, Britain, France, and of course today Israel, the behavior of all the other nuclear powers has been defensive. They have not sought to create nuclear wars and so on. So I do think that we have to take sides. I think we have to take sides at an international level as well. I mean, I think it's easier for us to take sides domestically because we would all agree we don't want fascists, we don't want Trump, we want people like Mamdani, etc. We're all totally in agreement. But I think that a lot of us fight shy of taking sides where states are concerned. And I'm not trying to deny the difficulty of it, but I'm trying to encourage everybody to think about which states to take the side of. And I think that when you have a capitalist state, they will essentially work in the interest of an, as I say, ever narrowing capitalist elite, not the capitalist class in general, but Musk and maybe a couple of dozen people like him. I mean, that's a very narrow elite. Sorry, I've spoken too long, but I think I'll stop with those 2 points.
Not at all. Yeah. And thank you for being here. I know you have to leave at 12, you said. So I wish you well. And thanks again.
Thank you.
I wonder if somebody can, maybe Guy can address this.
Professor Darity has his hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sandy, go ahead. I didn't see that.
No, I just wanted to echo a version of Radhika's comment, which is I don't think we can have any expectation of coping with the current chaos or reversing the current chaos unless we address the question of who are the political leaders in the United States.
Right. I suppose that supports what Radhika is saying. Yeah. Well, I guess the question I had for Guy, only because he is the master in this area, if there is, let's say climate change hits in the way in which Guy says it does, abrupt climate change, where everything falls apart. I mean, do you think the species disappears or only large volumes, large amount, large numbers disappear, but that somehow pockets of humanity survive? And that question is also for Ivana. If there is a nuclear strike of catastrophic proportions, does humanity disappear, or are there still, is the possibility of the continuity of the human race, is that also extinguished? But that's something that's always troubled me. And I wonder if there's any answers possible on that from both Guy and from Ivana.
Well, I'd love to think that we will persist, that life on Earth will persist, but I just don't see that happening because we reduce the use of fossil fuels, we reduce the burning of fossil fuels somehow, which almost certainly would result from a large-scale war, for example, that at the global level we will be forced to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and then invokes the aerosol masking effect. And James E. Hansen has indicated many times in presentations, peer-reviewed papers, and so on, that the aerosols fall out of the atmosphere in about 5 days. And so that's what we would expect after that is a very rapid increase in global average temperature, probably on the order of 2°C within a few days. And I just don't see us or many other species surviving that. And our species in particular is so poorly constructed for making the kind of adaptations, making the kind of changes that would be required. We're big squishy animals without any protection. I'd love to have it turn out some other way. I'd love to hear some evidence that I'm wrong. I'd love to be wrong about almost everything I say, in fact, but I just don't think that's the case.
I see. What do you think, Ivana?
Well, I mean, here I would quote Einstein in saying, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And I don't know if it's more optimistic that I slightly disagree with Guy. I think pockets of humanity will continue, but they will be the Stone Age, right? The civilization will end. The world as we know it will end. And I think that in the case of just nuclear war and however that really plays out, and some of what we talk about in terms of the climate effect, the ozone layer, the structure, again, very, very, very dependent on the scenario. I don't know exactly which scenario will take place, but I can tell you that up to 6 billion people could die within 2 years of a nuclear war just from starvation. And that is going to be in pockets again, because no one's going to live in Canada where it's just going to be frozen, and no one's going to be exporting food either. So if you can't grow your own food, you're not going to have any food. And we don't even, the reality is we don't actually know what that societal collapse exactly looks like, because we do now live in these highly interconnected global economies and societies. One of the things that could happen in case these, nuclear armed states decide to go at it, you could destroy electrical grids over entire countries by using the electromagnetic pulse. You don't even have to kill everybody, right? You just shut down the electricity. I cannot imagine what happens in the United States if we all of a sudden don't have electricity. And this is not a blackout. This is the electricity is not coming back. It's just not coming back. And so what does that look like for food distribution? For, people will literally have car accidents on the road, like everything that depends on any kind of electrical, wiring will stop working. Planes will fall out of the sky. I mean, we really are talking about the end of the world. And again, my view is something will continue. Do I want to be a part of it? No, I'm gonna like head for the mushroom, head for the explosion in Times Square, and that was Khrushchev's quote was the survivors will envy the dead, right? So I mean, my goal is we don't get there, and by actually addressing this nuclear threat, we learn how to cooperate, we learn how to acknowledge these, and then maybe we can make, I teach about climate, so I'm not ignorant on this at all. I don't think it's imminent in the sense that we're all going to die in the next 5 years. I certainly don't think it's imminent at the level of the species. I think, absolutely what you're saying, some of the feedbacks will continue to build and build and build. But I think I want to be an optimist. I want to think that there is time to figure out how to address that in a way that actually doesn't mean that the species is over. That would be my hope.
Okay. Fadhel, what do you think? You are involved in ambitious plans for reconstructing most of the world, especially Africa. How do those plans sit with the things we have just heard about climate change, about nuclear war, and so on? How does that, are these externalities that you put aside, or are they work into your system?
No, these are very serious and sadly very likely scenarios. All of this gloom and doom that we're listening to in terms of climate catastrophe, economic collapse, nuclear confrontation, all of this is very, very likely scenarios that we're talking about. And I mean, remember the last couple of years worth of live streaming genocide, children being starved to death, snipers shooting at children, and Western elites, political elites, bending over backwards to justify that it's just fine, that it's just this is totally fine. And we're now seeing reports of this investigation that is happening in Italy from the 1990s during the Bosnia War, that the wealthy elites were paying top dollars to go on safari trips to Sarajevo to shoot people on the streets as a tourist destination. So if we're talking about the Western elite somehow saving us from all of this collapse, I mean, these are not people who care about science to begin with. If they're willing to pay top dollars to go shoot people, right? If they're bending over backwards to justify the most horrific genocide that we've seen in the last few months, live stream genocide, you think they care about the fossil fuel collapse or the climate collapse? They don't care. They're building space shuttles to colonize other planets, to live in this delusion of a world that they want to create for themselves, just for themselves, right? So
But
change is not going to come from the West. It's not going to come from those elites. The burden is on us, the people of the global South, to have a coherent vision for ourselves. Because if you don't have a vision, long-term strategic vision for yourself, you're always going to be part of somebody else's vision. And we know what the Western vision of the world is, and that's just leading towards collapse and chaos, right? So that's the world in which I operate, and it's sad, but it's realistic, right? All the parameters that we discussed today are reality. The clock is ticking, and it's up to us in terms of how we take charge of this world that we live in. Because if we leave it up to them, it's leading to its natural destruction mode.
I think that's a great point. That is the reverse of what people commonly think about global warming, that it's going to be worse for the third world. And those poor brown people will suffer more, not such a problem for us. I've literally read that in the economics literature, let alone in the media. In fact, if there's going to be any resilience, it's going to be in the third world because you're close to the production systems to begin with. The distance between the average American and where food is actually grown is gigantic. And equally, you have fractious societies. America's got to be the most fractious empire in history. They're likely to kill themselves before they start killing it. Well, it'll be a toss-up whether they kill themselves first or the rest of the world first. The only cultures that I think have got a chance of surviving are two extremes. China, because the cooperative and the state-driven and the engineering focus of that country sets it well and truly apart, I think, from any country in history. If any country has a plan to try to survive global warming, it's China. So I'd back that country for a level of sophistication. The other extreme, and people often ask me, where do I think people would survive? I go for the New Guinea Highlanders. They're high enough above the equator that they won't suffer the same overwhelming heat. They're hunters and gatherers by background. I practice quite a few of them already. And they've survived in isolation for an enormous period of time. They're the other ones. They're the humans I think might see survive. The rest of us, I can't see us making it the century.
Okay. Sandy, I was just curious. You didn't mention issues that really have been at the forefront, aside from leadership and so on, which is the prospect, the imminent prospect of global war between, I guess, fundamentally the new group, emergent nations, some of them anyway, and the West, which seems determined to push the envelope here. How does that not scale into your description? Is it just individual leaders? Let's say our leadership were different. The empires would still go at each other similarly, wouldn't they?
I'm not sure. My dream would be the elimination of empire-centered leaders.
Right.
But obviously, the creation of hot wars is very much on the table, right, including the actual presence of ongoing hot wars. Maybe one of the most striking instances of the attempt to provoke a hot war is the United States' current practice of bombing boats that are coming out of Venezuela.
Maybe I'll ask Genevieve whether she thinks collapse is imminent, or is she building on some form of hope or optimism, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think that we have to keep working, even if we believe it's going to collapse. So there may be possibilities we haven't seen. And life is an excellent thing. A beautiful planet is fantastic. People are fantastic. And I believe that we do have this stream or this aspect of maternal values and a maternal human, and that the kind of government we ought to have would be an egalitarian, matriarchal government. That might bring about the change in values, or the change in values might bring about that kind of government that would allow us to survive and not create these most horrible endings for ourselves. But I don't know if we have time.
Well, I don't believe people are fantastic, but I certainly think this panel is fantastic. That includes you, Genevieve. But I'll invite any final comments from anybody on this before I say a couple of things. Anybody really on, is there an issue we left out? I think war we didn't talk about. We talked about nuclear problems and climate change, but not just the prospect of World War III, which seems to be the most imminent right now, given what's going on. But anyway, it's up to you, whatever you want to say. Steve, what do you think of that? He's gone.
Ivana has her hand up.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead, Ivana.
Yes, no, I just actually wanted, I know Radhika left, but I sort of wanted to agree with her that in so many of the issues that we're facing, we have the kind of economics of capitalism at the root of the problem. One of the reasons it's very hard, it's been very hard for decades to get rid of nuclear weapons is because the military-industrial complex benefits from the enormous spending that the government expands on this. Similarly, issues like healthcare, why is it so hard to get, to do healthcare right in the United States? I know other civilized countries have better models. It's the same issue of that kind of capitalist greed and putting sort of the welfare of the many really aside to advance the wants of the very few. I think it's at the root of the environmental problem too, because as long as you have to constantly expand, grow these companies, corporations, everything has to grow constantly, right? To keep feeding the stock market or whatever, that is coming again at the expense of both the people and the environment. So anyway, thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Fadhel has his hand up.
Yeah, Fadhel, go ahead.
Just as a closing thought, I think it's very important for us to remember the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, when he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism." And similarly today, I think the worst thing that could happen to us, those of us who actually care about these issues and trying to address these issues, is to become the victims of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, and dangerous distractions. So I think the most important contribution that people on this kind of gathering can provide to the world is this analytical lens that says, watch out, these are the false solutions, these are the dangerous distractions, these are the tactics that the system is using to delay and deny and so on. And if we can avoid wasting time and energy and resources and misdirecting people, then at least we'll have a chance to leverage our resources and capabilities to push in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay. Assuming Steve is available, is he? I'm not sure. If Steve is not going to speak, then I would like to just conclude this. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I had to go out for it shortly, so I missed some of the conversation, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but any concluding thoughts about what we've done today?
Oh, just again, make the point that humanities need to really read what climate scientists have been writing about. The seriousness and the scale of this is far beyond what is common knowledge in the humanities. And that is one of the reasons for our paralysis. So I'd urge people to, I'll push one of my own articles called The Appallingly Bad Neoclassical Economics of Climate Change, and a report for a group called Carbon Tracker, which will give you more detail on the science as well as how bad the economics has been. But you have to be conscious of that to realize just how serious this threat is. Guy gave you a feeling for it. I'm emphasizing Guy's perspective that this could be about the extinction of the human race.
In that event, in that case, let me conclude with two quotations which are my staple. They seem to always reverberate. One comes from Ben Franklin, and he said, "People who live on hope usually die of starvation." I think that's an interesting quote. And then on the other hand, there's Samuel Beckett. And here's what he said. He said, "I try and I fail. But then I try again and I fail better." So maybe all we can do, even if we fail, is to try again and better. So let's conclude with that. And let's all give some thanks to Diane, who was invisible and yet was guided and monitored everything. So please say thank you to her. Diane, you might show yourself. Thank you for everything. So thank you all. Very grateful for your appearances, and I respect all your opinions, no matter how they diverge from my own. So I'm happy that you're here, and perhaps we'll pick this up next semester, assuming the world is still there and our predictions are not completely true. Anyway, thank you all. Have a pleasant rest of the month, rest of the year.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right.